Dina Dye here with Foundations in Torah. Welcome to this week's Torah portion, Kedoshim, which means holiness. From the root Kedushah, to be holy, to be set apart. We'll talk about that in just a second. This entire Torah portion is dealing with the Ten Commandments, and in particular an elaboration on each one of those commandments. It's not my intention to go through each one, but to give you kind of an overview of the concept of holiness. Holiness, again, means to be separate, to separate oneself from something else. It was always related to the entire community. Holiness was never about an individual. We don't really see anywhere in Scripture except in one place where an individual is referred to as being holy. The environment of the temple was that holy, sacred space. So the priesthood was holy. The spaces in the temple were holy, different courtyards, vessels, rituals, ceremonies, furniture, etc. Everything in that context was holy, that is, set apart. Set apart for a function and a purpose, because that is the nature of what holiness is. So it means to differentiate, and with that it implies a restriction, or that something is forbidden. Probably the best example that we know of something being holy, if you will, because it is set apart for a function and purpose in which something is forbidden, would be the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Because you'll recall, it is in the sacred space, in the midst or in the center of the garden, and the fruit was forbidden to be eaten. So it was holy, set apart. We've got to get out of the mindset that holy means to be morally elevated or super righteous or super spiritual. That's not what it means. And so here was this object, if you will, in the center of the garden that was, in a sense, holy. It was set apart because they were forbidden. Adam and Eve were forbidden to eat of the tree. There were limitations and restrictions placed on the tree. Now, you know, if you go into the temple, there are limitations and restrictions on where you could go depending on who you were. If you were a woman, you could go to certain places, court of the women, but you couldn't enter into the ulam, the porch, or the holy place. The Levites functioned in certain places. The priests went in and served the temple, served the various vessels and ceremonies, and of course only the high priest could go into the Holy of Holies. So that place was restricted and forbidden for the rest of the priests, and for the Levites, and for the men of Israel, and for the women of Israel, etc. So it was forbidden because it had a purpose and function. You could not violate that. John Walton had a really good quote. He said that in the ancient world, something came into existence when it was separated out as a distinct entity, given a function, and given a name. So everything is in terms of function. Separation, holiness, restrictions placed on it were for the purpose of for function. So we have this concept Kedushah, which basically means holiness, was set for periods of time. So for instance, the Shabbat acted in the same way. You had the 6 days, the common days, the profane days, if you will, but then set apart and named with a specific function was the Shabbat. And it was declared holy. In fact, it's the very first thing in Scripture that was given this element of holiness to it. And of course, with the Shabbat came restrictions and certain activities that were forbidden. So again, the temple environment, it was set apart with formal legal restrictions and limitations. This is the definition of holiness. So those restrictions were for a purpose and a function, and they protected the sanctity of the space. We see the same thing with the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. You'll remember that it was in the center, in the midst of the garden, the central sanctuary, the garden sanctuary, and it was the fruit of that tree was forbidden to be eaten. So this is our definition then of holiness. So Adam and Eve could not eat of the fruit of that tree. It was forbidden fruit. The tree in itself was not intrinsically bad, but on it were limitations and restrictions where only certain things could happen. So God is speaking over and over again in this passage. He is telling Israel not to do the things that the nations around them do, in particular Canaan. Of course, that would be the land that they would inherit, but they were to separate themselves out from the other nations. And they did the same thing. They separated themselves out by their activities, and certain things were forbidden by the foods. Certain foods were forbidden, eating between kosher and non-kosher foods. Of course, they ate only the kosher. So all of this was to distinguish Israel from the other nations. And that the reason the distinction came was because Israel had a purpose and a function, and that was to bear fruit. So when you violate the holiness of the space, when you go against what has been limited or restricted, death comes. And of course, with death, there's no life, and it is fruit that produces life. Death, of course, that's death is death. And so that is the nature. Holiness produces life. The opposite of that is death. So they were holy, set apart for a purpose and a function. The function is to produce life. And so we see all these things in this particular Torah portion. There's a list of things that cause death. There is no fruit. And so they were to expel that nation from the land of Canaan. And God says, you are to be unto me a holy people. I am holy. I have set you apart from all the other people so that you can belong to me, so that you can produce fruit. They're not to follow the customs of the other nations, and God would drive those other nations out of the land. And God saw those activities because they did not, the activities did not, they were against the restrictions and limitations, and he saw them as disgusting practices. Again, the land being their inheritance. Now, one of the things, as I mentioned earlier, the danger here is that when we sort of attach the concept of holy to somebody, and we think that they're morally perfect and super righteous and all that sort of thing. A part of what we have in this Torah portion is a caution against excess in doing the right thing. So sometimes, yes, you can do the right thing, but you can also do it in excess. And it talks about not overdoing it in terms of eating certain foods, or even though they're the prescribed foods. The idea is not to see how much you can get away with. It's not to go up to the edge of the boundary and stick your foot over and pull it back in and see, did God see that? Is that okay? The call is to be separate. And so even those things that are permissible are to be done for the sake of heaven and not for personal enjoyment. Rabbi Cooley, here's a quote from him. He says, whenever a person keeps a commandment, he creates a garment of light for the soul. And this is the garment the soul wears in the world to come. I thought that was really beautiful. So all the things that we do for the sake of heaven and not for, if you will, personal enjoyment. We don't push the boundary out as far as we can. That's what our kids do. That's what 2-year-olds do. They push those boundaries to see how much they can get away with. That is not supposed to be our walk. Again, our walk, we are separate, we are distinct, we are holy in that we recognize that which has restrictions placed on it, and we don't violate those restrictions or those limitations. We stay within the boundary, and we keep the commandments in that way for the not for personal enjoyment, but for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. So I hope that has helped your understanding this week about the concept of Kedoshim or holiness. And now you can go back and reread the Torah portion, and with that understanding in mind, it'll help you make sense, perhaps a little more, of the concept of Kedusha. See you next time. Shalom.